There's no one I would rather discuss this with than my next two guests. George Will is a syndicated columnist and MSNBC contributor who personally left the Republican Party during the 2016 election, shortly after Donald Trump had clinched the party's nomination. And Charlie Sykes is a longtime conservative commentator and critic of President Trump. He's also editor-in-chief of The Bulwark and an MSNBC contributor. Gentlemen, I want you both to sort of take on two different aspects of this. Charlie, I'm going to ask you to talk about the media landscape. George, I want to ask you about sort of conservative intellectual circles. So let me start with the following. I want to play for you what a former presidential candidate, when he was running for president, Scott Walker, what he said while he was an active presidential candidate and he was in the UK. Take a listen to this.
I think particularly when it comes to foreign policy, I just think you say maybe it is a bit old-fashioned, but I think there was some sense in the past to saying that when you're in any country, not just the United Kingdom, that you're anywhere else around the world, no matter what my opinions might be of this president of the United States right now, I just don't think it's wise to undermine the president of your own country.
Now, in February of 2015, Scott Walker was considered one of the leading 3 or 4 candidates for president, George. He said that. We could say he said that because he thought it was right, or we could say he said that because he thought there'd be a penalty if he did somehow criticize a sitting American president overseas. That was only 4 years ago.
Look, if they didn't have situational ethics, as they say, they'd have no ethics at all. They have a certain versatility of conviction. And there's a parallel for this. They said, we're for free trade. And Trump said, by the way, no, you're not anymore. And they said, OK, we're not anymore. He said, we support our intelligence community. He says, no, we're on the side of Putin. So they fell silent. We're afraid of North Korea. They said, well, Trump says, no, actually, we're in love, Kim and I. And so they fell silent. There is a historical analogy that's really fun to this kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. The Republicans in Congress in the last 3 years resemble the American Communist Party in the late 1930s. They were all for America supporting anti-fascists, resisting the Nazis, until August 23rd, 1939, when Stalin and Hitler reached their non-aggression pact. The Communist Party turned on a dime and said, no, actually, we want non-involvement in Europe's quarrels. That was their position until June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union and the Communist Party turned on a dime and said, now we must all join the fight against fascism. Same mentality, Republicans, communists.
What would you do if you were John Bolton right now?
So, depends on how much he needs the job. But
I mean, you've been told everything he's worked for. Whatever you think of John Bolton, there are a lot of people that have strong opinions about John Bolton that watch this broadcast. Whatever you think of him, one thing I thought he was is sort of, he's pretty sure of his own views. What is he doing?
Well, he may think I can stay inside and still work to change them. The real question is, what was Trump thinking? Because Bolton hasn't changed. And Trump hasn't changed. He just disagrees with Bolton on almost everything.
Charlie Sykes, I've got a different little montage to play for you. It is a montage of media criticism from the conservative echo chamber when a president of the United States appeared with the president of Cuba. Take a listen to this.
While the world burns, President Obama takes in a baseball game with a brutal dictator.
President Obama is under fire from being out of touch with his own country.
The optics of him sitting next to a communist dictator.
Going to the baseball game. Attended a baseball game.
Sitting at a baseball game. What he did yesterday embarrassed me as an American.
He went to a baseball game in Cuba doing the wave with communist dictators. What is your reaction to that? I know what mine is.
It certainly looks terrible.
Charlie Sykes, in some ways, the montage speaks for itself. It's not much to add, but I do think if the president thought there was a penalty to pay from even his own favorite channel, perhaps he would have curtailed his behavior, but they enable him to. They celebrate this now.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, but that was then. And, you know, again, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine, you know, if Barack Obama said what Trump said about Vladimir Putin or what he said about Kim, their hair would have been on fire. Their heads would have exploded. You know, but again, this is the situational ethics that we're seeing. And watching the Republican Party and the media move from being, well, we're reluctant supporters, we're transactional, we don't want to make him mad because we might be primaried or because the audience won't like it, to now becoming this active active, enabling, and cheerleaders of all of this. The way they've gone from being about ideas and about party to really all about, whatever the great leader wants them to say. And it really is extraordinary. I mean, you want to talk about, the canary in the coal mine. Where's Mitt Romney? Mitt Romney was the one guy willing to speak, and the fact that he's silent. Look at Liz Cheney throwing out words like treason. Right. Justin Amash, of course, is the one person who is talking about the rule of law. He's an outcast. Liz Cheney is in leadership, and Mitt Romney is in witness protection. And that tells you kind of where the Republican Party is right now.
Well, I think, George, is it fair to say, again, I want you to tackle this idea. I guess there is no principles to the Republican Party. I mean, this was your argument of why you left. It's just a cult of personality.
Exactly. It's an interesting question. Would we have this kind of behavior if we had term limits? If they didn't have the hopes of an indefinite re-election to Congress? If they were only here?
I don't know. I go back and forth. I fear term limits because of the lobbyists don't have them.
I used to.
Yeah.
And then I wrote a book recanting my opposition to term limits. Yes, because I think term limits changes your motives for entering politics and your motives for behaving in politics. If these people were term limited, I think they'd show more spine.
I certainly understand why more and more people think that. Charlie Sykes, what about the media enabler aspect of things? I mean, the fact of the matter is the president has created this echo chamber, or the echo chamber has helped facilitate him. We could sit here and argue the chicken and egg aspect of this, but there doesn't seem to be a good, I mean, if you convince them all to stay in their own silos and don't even get factual news, it is hard to penetrate the Kool-Aid.
No, this is exactly right. And it's no longer an echo chamber. It is an alternative reality silo, and he depends on that. He understands that there are no gatekeepers. There are no referees who are going to say, okay, this is really, really inappropriate, and that make him pay a price for all of that. So this is, again, the new reality that Donald Trump is enjoying. Now, look, you would think that there would be at least a little bit of residual shame on the part of, on the part of some of the media to change their standards as dramatically as they have. But apparently, they've gone along with all of this. And again, term limits doesn't solve that. This is part of the tribal identity on the right.
Is it worth, George, is it worth Bill Weld or Larry Hogan to have this sort of create an intellectual rigor inside the Republican Party, or are you better off doing what you did and just go outside of it, do what Charlie's done? They sort of have gone outside of it because the Republican Party and Trump's reality have been merged.
No, Bill Weld is creating a political market. He's giving an alternative commodity out there. Markets generate information. We're going to learn how many Republicans, rank-and-file Republicans, never mind the mediocrities in Congress, how many of them are uneasy about this? We know.
Is he the right vehicle, or is he a flawed vehicle for this?
He's got his flaws, but he's the right vehicle in the sense that he really doesn't care, and he has an aristocratic langueur in his opposition.
There's a small government thing to him that you like.
Exactly. Yeah, he's read his Hayek, and he believes his Hayek, and he knows why he dislikes Trump. Yeah. And he'll laugh at him. The one thing Mr. Trump cannot stand is laughter, and he's going to get some of that from Bill Weld.
Right. What about on the media front, Charlie? I mean, it is, I know some of the folks working with you, and on one hand, one of my favorite lines from one of your colleagues is saying, the great thing about the Trump era is that you found out who's really a conservative and who's really just trying to make a buck.
Yes, we found out how lightly held some of those principles are. Look, I mean, the reality is that outside of Congress, the conservative, if you want to be a conservative or a quote-unquote conservative right now, if you want to matter, if you want to be relevant, you need to apparently get on board with the Trump train. But I do think that there are people out there who are, keeping their heads down. These are not profiles in courage, but that at some point, if their conscience is pricked, if there is leadership, if there is a moment, you will start to hear from them. But boy, it certainly doesn't feel like we're going to be hearing from them between now and next November.
The unintended consequence, George Will, of sending the message that as long as you echo the president's talking points about his political opponents and you're a world leader, you can suck up to him. You can get what you want. Are we not? Where's the alarm on this? As we know, politics is a copycat operation, whether we like it or not. Other world leaders are watching. Everybody's watching how easily you can transact with this president.
Well, that's right. But there will come a time when Mr. Trump will not be here anymore. If it's 6 years from now or 2 years from now, people are going to wake up and say, what did you do during the war?
You're assuming the term limits of the current Constitution hold, but anyway, go ahead.
Plus the 22nd Amendment. Yes, I think they will wake up and say, what did you do during the war, Daddy? Did you defect to the other side? And some people are going to be embarrassed, assuming they're capable of embarrassment.
I think it's possible that support for Trump will be akin to what support for the Iraq War is inside the Democratic Party at times. But we'll see. It took 4 or 5 years for that to be the case.
I think you're optimistic.
George Will, thank you, sir. We got a lot of national stuff to talk about. Charlie Sykes, thank you. Thank you both. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.